this session, for me, this conference is a kind of deja vu, because 20 years ago I participated in producing a movie called The Wars of the Jews, מלחמות היהודים, and many of the names that were mentioned here of Eitan Ginat and others, I worked with them and I interviewed them 20 years ago. Many of the questions of why nobody knows, etc., we asked those questions 20 years ago, and the same answers of משרד החינוך, etc., were given 20 years ago and 10 years ago. It's a wake-up call every 10 years, actually. But this session is very unique because as a scholar that knows most of the researchers and the publications about these issues, I didn't know anything, and like I talked with Uri, I thought that we are talking about postmodernic hermeneutics and etc. So this will be a unique session dealing with we call it literature and correspondence as historical source, but I think that every one of them dealing with another issue that is only very briefly correlated with the main topic. So let me introduce the three of them together, and then I give the floor to them. Leonid Smilovitsky is a chief researcher at the Goldstein-Goren Diaspora Research Center in Tel Aviv University and a former researcher at the Yad Vashem Archives in Jerusalem and the Belarus State Museum of History of the Great Patriotic War, associate professor at the Belarus State University of Culture, author of 4 monographs, Jews in Belarus. I asked Irena Kantorovich why once is Belarus and one is Belarusia. So I know the answer now. Jews in Belarus from our common history, 1905, 1953. The second one, Holocaust in Belarusia, 1941, 1944. Jews, sorry if I mispronounce it, Jews in Turov. History of shtetl in
Moser region.
And Jewish life in Belarus or Belarusia during the final decade of the Stalin regime, and now the new one that is in press already, censorship in Belarus after World War II. This is will be our first speaker. The second one, Uri Cohen, holds a PhD from the Hebrew University, has served on the faculty of Columbia University, and teaches Hebrew and Italian literature at Tel Aviv University. He is the author of Survival, Census of Deaths Between the World Wars in Italy and Palestine, as well as a novel and a documentary film, Ida Fink, Traces of a Life, in 2004. His book on the Israeli postmodern and poetics of Orly Castle-Bloom appeared in 2011. He has published on a variety of topics that range from the prose of Primo Levi to Israeli cinema. He has edited and introduced the translation of Giorgio Agamben, Remnants of Auschwitz, and the essays of Pasolini into Hebrew, as well as a book by Eri De Luca, currently writing on Primo Levi and finishing a book on the Hebrew cultures of war. From this project, Unraveling the 48 War, appeared in Jewish Social Studies, and a chapter on captivity Captivity in Hebrew literature is forthcoming from Van Leer. He's an editor of Ot, a literary journal currently working on a special issue, the Yom Kippur War, from a cultural perspective. And the third speaker will be Raquel Stepak, PhD in Hebrew literature, researcher at the Laura Schwarzkopf Center of Hebrew Literature and Culture at Tel Aviv University. Her dissertation entitled The Community of Hebrew Writers in Eretz Israel and its Response to the Holocaust, 1939-1945, which was written under the instruction of Professor Dan Laor, Tel Aviv University, has recently received the Schnitzer Award for publication and is to be published by the Kibbutz HaMe'uchad. So the floor is theirs. בבקשה, Leonid. Minutes.
Soviet Jews rise to the Red Army, 1941-1945. With the beginning of the Soviet-German War, huge masses of the population had been moved to various regions of the Soviet Union. Letters remained practically the only means of communication between the people who find themselves in completely new and unfamiliar circumstances. It's difficult to overestimate the role of the field post in the war years. It became a kind of system which fed the complex organism of a great country that fought for its life. During the war years 1941-1945, from 490 to 520,000 of Soviet Jews joined the Red Army. No less than 1.5 million of Jews were evacuated or fled from territories of hostility: Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Baltic states, Moldova, Crimea, Caucasus, to the deep Soviet hinterland, Kazakhstan, the Central Asia, Bashkiria, Urals, Siberia, and Far East. After the war, the publications of letters in the Soviet Union were as a rule made on the occasion of anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany. However, in the Soviet times never appeared a collection of letters about the difficult situation in the hinterland, hunger, difficult work of evacuees, criminal situations, epidemic, infant mortality, or hard work in kolkhozes. The tasks and goals of our archives, which I built 3 years ago, was the following: to collect, to preserve, and to study the letters and other documents of personal origin, honor lists, identity cards, photographs, and etc., taken from the families of war participants and their descendants. Second, creating a database for scholarly and educational programs related to the history of the World War II. Third, systematizing of data obtained from the personal correspondence described the situation at the front line and in the hinterland. The information about genocide of the Jews, on the relations between the Jews and non-Jews, and so on. We also want to clear up the problem of evacuation, organized and not accommodation of the refugees in the Soviet hinterland, culture and social activity. The collection contains letters and sources of the personal provenance of the war participants without regard their ethnicity. So not only Jews, but also non-Jews. On the one hand, it's a tribute. On the one hand, it's a tribute to the merits of all soldiers and officers of the Red Army, both Slavic and non-Slavic origin. And on the other hand, the necessity of comparative analysis. And we make also a system from wartime, and this work has an agent character. Under our very eyes, the large generation of witnesses and participants in the way is going away. Thus, the people able to comment the documents of personal origin which they keep. The results of this painstaking and multi-phased work of many years. Here you can see a picture from working room of our archive. It is before reading. And this is also some pictures. To my mind, it's very impressive. Before reading. And altogether, the collection of war letters at our center has mail and the personal objects of 332 war participants, nearly 5,000 letters. The most valuable part of the collection is so-called letter archives, 28 files which contain a collection of tens and hundreds of letters obtained from the single family. They show almost daily correspondence between the front line and the hinterland. The correspondence gives an idea of emotional experiences, feelings, plans, hopes, daily life, responses to the news from the front, tales of struggles, works and life in the evacuation, and in 10 of the front life. And all these letters give our imagination of the war epoch. All the text, the letters that we have opportunity to collect, usually typed in Word program and hard copies printed. Most letters are accompanied by the photographs of the correspondence, childhood, before conscription, army service, and of the survivors, post-war photos, including family photos, and by comments. And besides that, we collect all documents of personal origins which could to comment such letters. We make a typology of the letters, the following. Letters in Yiddish. 2 years ago, I make a report at Yad Vashem conferences, specially dedicated to this topic. And now the text of this of my presentation at Yad Vashem is possible to see at the website of the Diaspora Research Center, and also we are going to publish it as a special chapter of my future book. Here is an example of a letter of Moti Vitebsky in Mozdok district, North Caucasus, to his parents, 1942. Please pay attention. The address is written in Russian, and the whole text inside is written in Yiddish. I have 18 letters of Moti Vitebsky in Russian, and 19, the next letter was in Yiddish, where he asked, why don't you answer? Why don't you answer? Did you receive my letters? And so on. So all these letters as a little which give opportunity to make a conclusion. Children letters to the parents at the front line from the region of evacuation. It is the letter of a little girl, somewhat about she is 10 years old, to his father. Poems. Amateurish, self-composed, written by professional authors, copied from newspapers and books, borrowed from the college and army. Here is the letter poems of Zori Kapstein to his parents. Letter of Semyon Leiferov, also a poem to his daughter. Official letters of merit and gratitude, personal letters of merit from commanders of regiment, division, front, the supreme commander. And pay attention as the family names and surnames of these letters of merit. Friedman Abram Emanuilovich. Shapira Boruch Aronovich, Edelman Rosa Moiseyevna, Weinstein Abram Aronovich, and so on. So to my mind, it's very impressive when we see the Soviet Red Army list of merits with the Jewish names. In addition to following groups of letters arranged as Germany and Germans in the eyes of the Jews, blockade Leningrad, inquiries about the fate of relatives left on the occupied territories, laconic letters, minimum information, several words only to tell the relatives that one is alive and well, unique letters in form and content, and very interesting points as caricatures. Caricatures or cartoons in anti-Nazi Soviet caricatures were very popular in the Red Army, also a part of Soviet propaganda. There is a real industry of such postcards, not tens, hundreds of anti-Nazi caricatures with the postcards deflated from the soldiers in Hitler.
Oh, thank you.
A Red Army anniversary. Next groups of the letters can be, I defined it as censorship, Palestine, portraits, the opening of the Second Front, for example, portraits, works of artists, amateurs, self-taught painters, students of art institutions. It was difficult to make a photo, and the relative asked to send a picture. So they make a picture by a pencil. And I want to show you two postcards. The opening dedicated the opening of the Second Front, Soviet American-British military cooperation. It is 1944. Correspondence with Palestine during the wartime. Also, letters from Moscow to Tel Aviv, from Leningrad to Jerusalem, in Russian with the signs of English military censors, Russian military censors, and we can read here Tel Aviv, Bilu Street. It is now the really middle center of the modern Tel Aviv. National self-identification. Jews in front and in the rear areas differed from those by non-Jews. It was an extremely sensitive moment, not reflected in the post-war Soviet historiography, because it doesn't fit the myth of fraternal friendship of the Soviet people, which has withstood the test of war. A Jew in the war felt differently than a non-Jew. He had constantly proved his usefulness as a patriot and a fearless fighter. At the same time, only Jews had a sense of collective responsibility. If any individual Jew demonstrated cowardness, dishonest, or other faults, it was immediately transferred to all the Jews. So it was before the war, it was during the war, and it was after the war. Deprived of tradition, detached from religion, not knowing Yiddish, many Jews sincerely considered themselves Soviet people. At the same time, the state and surrounding Slavic and non-Slavic neighbors continued to see them as Jews. Growing the state anti-Semitism in the USSR, supported by domestic anti-Semitism in the rear and in the front, made the Jewish population largely vulnerable, if not defenseless. And now I can give you an example of Staff Sergeant Zorik George Epstein. Epstein, in correspondence with his parents, repeatedly touched on this issue. This letter also has a mark of military censorship in it. He wrote, "The most severe disappointment was the understanding that a certain nationality is a parasite. I hate my nationality. I am ashamed of it. Nachpros, chiefs of food supply, doctors, the boy, and the one seeking to go to the rear. And also this abstain fall in the battle in the January of 1945. In letters we have a lot of information about the Holocaust. Letters contain information about Nazi crimes, murders of civilians, and mass destruction of the Jews. Briefly can be formulated as from the evacuation areas to the front, from the combat army to the rear, correspondence of ghetto survivors, letters of neighbors who survived occupation, responses to inquiries from the liberal areas, and the letters from the evacuation to relatives abroad. Censorship. Censorship is a very sensitive topic of my research, and everybody, or nearly everybody, think that if the soldiers and officers write a little in the letters, it was the main reason. The reason was censorship. It is not the truth to the end. But some things I want to point out and to make up for your attention. For example, most of prohibitions issued by military censorship were not justified. Formally, it was prohibited to write in letters the location of sender, geographical names, names of commanders, and in the letters from the rear, from the hinterland, prices, working hours of its institutions, and so on. Such things we can see at the armies of different countries, but only in the Soviet Union. The census submitted weekly reports to the security organs whether something suspicious was found in the letters. If so, the sender and the addresses were marked. And if you have a look at this picture, you see the work of censorship. Censorship here. Censorship. Bogatyrev letter to his sister in Leningrad. And a very interesting document, certificate of military censorship, Lieutenant Nechama Meirovna Kaminer. Why? Because a good number of Jewish girls mobilized to the Red Army worked as military censorship, in military census, as military census, because of their education, because of their languages, because of their motivations, and so on. So you can see one of the certificates of such Jewish girl who worked for the Soviet censorship. As a result, most of letters gave minimum of information. Both soldiers and officers were aware of that. Some of them wrote directly. You know that one can't find in my letters anything about our life. If you wish to learn the news, read newspapers. When we meet, I will tell you many things, and so on. But I came to the conclusion that also very important reason why the soldiers and the officers write so little in the letters was the level of their imagination, level of their culture, level of their education. They simply don't know how to express their feeling. And when we read the letter from an educated person with a high education, with a great experience of their life, we read a good number of interesting things, and the censorship don't touch. And limited time of the report will not allow to highlight the other important issues related to the web, because I can speak about my topic, military letters, not only hours but days without break. So we don't have such opportunity now, and I hope very much that when we publish the reports and lectures of our conference, in a number of months, in a year, you will have opportunity to see the full version of my report. And now we came to the conclusions. The Nazi genocide in the USSR collected a terrible harvest. Almost half of Soviet Jewry has been exterminated, about 2.5 million people. In addition to it, no less than 200,000 Jews were falling at the front, in partisan detachment, in the captivity. Tens thousands Jews died in Leningrad and near the front, as well as in hinterland of hunger and disease. And also, it's important that Jews didn't distinguish themselves from the Soviet citizens, but as follows from the letters, they were distinguished. In the war years, the prohibition to correspond with abroad temporarily lifted. However, in general, world Jewry had a very little knowledge of the situation in Judaism in the USSR. In the Red Army, the Jewish tradition was completely excluded. There could be no question about the kashrut or Jewish feasts, and the Jews who were killed by Nazis and their local collaborations considered by the Stalin's leadership and the Soviet power not as victims of the Nazi genocide, but as suffering Soviet citizens. Using the war letters, we get the possibility to follow how the image of the reality was formed in the people of the war generation, what they thought, what they felt, and what they had hoped. Concluding, one could say that war correspondence is a source that has been preserved against the odds of time. The inclusion in the scope of the scholarly studies of letters, diaries, and other sources of personal origin opens new prospects for the researchers in studying all aspects of the life of man of war, knowledge of which is necessary for the modern generation. In my report, which will be published, I hope it will be published, I speak thoroughly and in detail about the information about which I found in diaries written from 1941 to 1945. We have 10 diaries, Yumanim, in our archives. One of them very large, more than 100 pages.
Written by Jews?
Yes, also that's from Jews. Yes, from Jews. We have a very interesting letters from a non-Jew to his wife Jew. Jewish woman, with all the descriptions of what he saw on the front, relation to the Jewish soldiers, and so on. Also, we collect all possible family stories and asked to comment military letters. In many families, they preserve letters without reading, because it's difficult to read. And when we make a scanner, we type, and after that we send to the families and ask to comment them. And sometimes we have very interesting explanations. There is a letters with 2 or 3 words. It's all. And but people want and like to comment about these 3 or 4 words in the letter. So it's great historical sources for future generation and for our scholars to understand what has happened during the war with the Jews. And this work we continue every day. So to my mind, in somewhat about 3-4 years, it will be ready also a monograph about it with the all huge archive of the letters for another researches. Thank you very much for your attention.
It's open to the public now? It's open to the
Yes.
public now? Our next speaker is Uri Cohen, Dr. Uri Cohen, Captives and Captivity, the Hebrew Soldier and the Culture of War.
Okay. Yeah, speaking to historians is always להתחייב בנפשך, as we say in Hebrew, coming from literature. So forgive me if I'm imprecise about a few details. I do my best about the history, but it's always a different discipline. As Derek Penslar claims, it is impossible to understand the origins of Israel's military without probing the history of the relationship between the Jews and the use of force in modern times. I think that was this morning. Though I realize that this section is called literature as a historical source, I would like to suggest, in a similar manner, that the history of war can hardly be understood without understanding the culture of war. Literature is a source for historians, but it can also be seen as a source of a history of war that is an expression of a certain culture of war, not its result. Upon examination of the participation of the Hebrew soldiers, that is, Jews from Palestine in the British Army in World War II, as it appears in the literary sources, it becomes evident that though it is mainly a forgotten episode, beyond Chana Senish, it is crucial to our understanding of captivity in the Israeli military and its culture of war. A culture of war is not easily described, and as I've elsewhere claimed, in the Israeli case we can talk about a security style, a complex system that affects almost every aspect of life and determines the way we understand war in Israel, its history and its conduct. My argument in part is that this security style presents a radical break from other forms of Jewish power, and that the culture of war changes radically and paradigmatically with the publication of Palestine Royal Commission Report in July 1937, and as partition becomes the future of the British mandate. It is the moment Arab and Jewish populations in Palestine begin arming for conflict. The Yishuv meets Wingate, Charles Lord Wingate, and the embryo of Jewish military power is conceived in a colonial womb in the form of an irregular militia on the fringes of the regular army. With Wingate, a paradigm shift takes place, and power begins to be thought of in terms of a Jewish military force. This is a big argument. But it is well known that the Special Night Squads formed by Wingate in 1938 were an innovation in modern warfare on a global scale. Montgomery may have thought Wingate was a madman, but he presented a novel way of thinking about guerrilla warfare. In other words, he anticipated the age of low-intensity warfare, of decolonization and low-intensity warfare, in which regular armies would face various forms of armed citizenry, known under various interchangeable names, terrorists, partisans, guerrillas, that I include simply under the name of militias. In 1938, the bloody decade of conflict for the Jews in Palestine began. In this decade, Jews from the Yishuv will enlist and fight the local Arabs in revolt, the Germans in World War II, the British in the very short war of decolonization from the end of the World War to the end of the mandate, then the local Arabs again, and finally the Arab states. During the World War, the British trained and armed both a militia in the form of the Palmach and more than 30,000 Jewish soldiers from the Yishuv, this is all well known, who studied and gained experience in all manners of the regular army. From the beginning, Hebrew power was conceived in this double manner, and in World War II, a true opposition between service in the British Army and dedication to a local force grew and remained active for years to come. Laskov used to call it Miflaga, the party of the Palmach against the party of the brigade. As service in the British Army formed the core of the regular Israeli army, one cannot exaggerate the influence it had on the formation of power, the kind of war it wages, and the way we should interpret it. One of the realizations in my work on the security style has been that the style functions by sharing and propagating figures of war, and that these figures can form the basis for periodization, that is not based precisely on historical events. The different phases in the history of war are dominated by different figures of war that both define and express the temporal image of war, or rather the chronotype of war, if you thought. From a literary point of view, it is only fair to ask what we know of war and if we can meaningfully speak of a Jewish culture of war, and in what sense is such a culture different from that of the colonial overlords. In this case, Captivity is examined briefly, providing some insights into the tension between a culture of militia and that of a regular army, and their derivation from the British. The first and most important role of the security style is to deny the colonial origin of Jewish power. This tendency is readily evident in the place of this very episode, or if we think of, and I'm speaking not in the historical research, well, this is well researched, but in culture in general, in Israeli culture, the episode is hardly existing. Or if we think of Hannah Senesh and the way she's remembered, it is possible to go even further and claim that when Jewish power is contemplated as such during the first decade, it is always a story of failure. One can even claim that the first decade of failure extends into the 48 War, and indeed the entire first phase of the war is framed in terms of failure. Heroic, albeit, that is redeemed by the state army. This is what forms the basis for the enduring and utterly senseless belief that Jewish power is bound by political constraints, and that once unfettered, it will, with overwhelming force, complete all the tasks that the very much force has not been able to achieve. Failure, in terms of military power, is not simple or straightforward. We can almost say that most acts of heroism are acts of failure. Or rather, since the prime mission of a soldier, the true fulfillment of his vocation as a soldier, is to die in battle, all failures are successful. As the saying in the military goes, medals of honor are a sign that things went horribly wrong and are a way for the higher command to cover up their mistakes. Observing that failure can be successful if it contributes to winning the war does not go beyond the fact that history is told by the victors, and therefore most failures told are of that kind. In the case of the Hebrew power, Captivity and the many other failures of the first decade are redeemed by sovereignty and its military power, which is a small surprise since the security style becomes an organ of the state. Hebrew soldiers, Haim is a term that came into use during the war and is designed to underline the difference between the Yishuv and Diaspora Jews in general, and certainly during war. I have not found evidence of its usage in relation to the Hebrew battalion of World War I, and certainly it was not used during the 2 decades between the world wars. Yoav Gelber and others have provided us with a very detailed history of the volunteering as enlisting was called at the time, and there is little point in repetition. Though it is configured, configured as failure, volunteering was a huge success, and it formed the backbone of what became the Israeli army. Again, leaving out much detail, it is fair to claim that Ben-Gurion used the Palmach to contain the war while the regular army was formed, and that indeed, once formed under a clear leadership of service in the British Army, it quickly became the strongest military force in the area. Culturally speaking, the picture is a bit more complicated. Though the regular army won the 48 War, most of the heroism and the larger image of the war is attributed to the Palmach, that is, to the militia. These processes are complex, but the result is simple: the birth of a regular army with the self-consciousness of the militia, and a culture of war that upholds values that are true for the militia but are ill-suited for the regular army. This culture of power is completely hegemonic until 1973, and the War of October, its heroism and failures are its direct result. In the time left, I would like to explore one of the forms of failure that derives from the experience of Hebrew soldiers in World War II, that is captivity and becoming prisoners. The first figure, and perhaps the central and most important one, is that of captivity and becoming a prisoner of war, a possibility that is part of regular warfare and is entertained by all regulars' army, by all regular armies, certainly in democracies. There's much to be said about becoming a prisoner of war. It is, in fact, a gray area of warfare, so heavily regulated because it is such, because militaries have very little interest in promoting the possibility. Captivity is, in fact, a concession, a tacit agreement between soldiers that spare each other useless death. The captive is a failed soldier, one who has ultimately betrayed his oath to fight to the death. It is also evident that captivity, though perceived in particular terms, certainly in Israeli culture, is in fact only another form of incarceration, though it is one where the detainee is presumed innocent, at least by his own country. In fact, one of the first texts produced within the security style, perhaps even the first, is about a form of captivity that is incarceration in Palestine. It is a collection of letters written by Moshe Carmel, one of the Memgimel, the 43 Haganah prisoners, among them Moshe Dayan. The 43 were arrested on the 28th of August 1939 during more or less routine training. Their trial began in October and they received harsh sentences manifesting the change in British policy towards cooperation with Yishuv in combating the Arab insurgency. The book is called From Within the Walls, Miben Chomot, and the author was only named Asir Ivri, a Hebrew prisoner. And it begins with a kind of cipher, 43 letters, Mem Gimel Michtavim Lemem, 43 letters to M. It is an interesting read, especially in the way it demonstrates the kind of fusion between private and public that is characteristic of the security style. This is the precise achievement of the creation of a shared intimacy based in war. It is a founding principle of the security style, and it peaks in the war of decolonization, as the entire Yishuv shares the secret of the underground. Everybody is part of the secret. Everybody has a stake. And then you can ask, what is the secret that everybody's part of, etc. As the war progressed and Rommel approached Palestine, relations with the British became easier, and the 43 were released, most of them joining the war effort in some form. Gradually, and under great pressure from Yishuv leadership, Jews were enlisted into the Hebrew units, culminating with the creation of Jews. You all know this better than I do. Of these units, the first Hebrew one were auxiliary pioneers that saw battle in France and in Greece. 1,500, more or less, of these soldiers were stranded by the retreating British and became prisoners of war in Greece in the spring of 1941. After some initial fears, they were treated as British POWs, and they spent the rest of the war in stalags in Germany. It's not possible to survey all the literature that was written, but initially most of the publications during the war were about enlistment and becoming a soldier, itself a novelty of sorts in Hebrew letters, certainly. Not counting Brenner, etc. I know historians here. There are many exceptions. Furthermore, the Hebrew literary industry as we know it grew out of this wartime experience and was eager to publish such material. The major publishing house of the state, Apoalim, Kibbutz HaMauchad, and especially Amoved, were all formed during the war with the worried view of, in the case of Amoved, of supplying Hebrew Zionist content to the soldiers whose entrance into the imperial army created various forms of colonial anxiety. Among these, perhaps the most popular publication was Letters from the Desert by Moshe Mosimzon, and it was published by both Amoved and Kibbutz HaMauchad. It is again an epistolary account composed of the letters Mosimzon wrote home that are again perfectly addressed to the family as well as the public. In the immediate aftermath of the war, and before the scope of the destruction became clear, many publications about captivity and incarceration became available. Captivity is deemed a worthy war story, and in some cases it is clear that the authors thought they were writing the literature of the camps before the camps became the camps. Perhaps the best example of these texts is Letters to My Son by Yitzhak Ben Aaron. Ben Aaron, already a leader in the labor movement, was a petty officer, and the letters he wrote to his son appeared in the newspapers and later in book form. Again, the intimacy of the letters to the family is perfectly aligned with the public. And it seems clear that something about the war makes it so to an extreme level in the case of the fall. In the book, Ben Aaron describes life in the camp, its small battles and the even smaller successes in improving living conditions. He also addresses some interesting issues, explaining with apologetic tone why he is a prisoner of war and not dead, to his son. I appreciate I'm quoting, I appreciate your will to know exactly how I fell in the hands of the enemy. I will do my best to tell you, but I fear the story will not satisfy you. Our thinking is always aided by images, concepts like battle, war, captivity, hunger, etc. Are envisioned as if in a movie, full of color and electricity. The reality is different. In this case of captivity, I assume you see your father and his comrades as they defend themselves, rifle in hand to the last bullet, eventually defeated by the attacking German multitude. I don't deny things like this happened, but only a few soldiers were taken this way. The majority of the soldiers falling captive don't know anything about it. The fact that they are prisoners of war becomes known to them by a message from their commander, hours before they see a German soldier. And Gelber has also written about this. Ben Aaron relates to his son through the image of war and the role of cinema in the dissemination of this distorted image, bringing to mind Paulo Virilio's Cinema and War and the connection between military technologies of sight and cinema. Words, it would seem, convey a deeper reality of war. Curiously, the reality of war is captivity, at least the kind of depersonalized war he is in. The insight discloses that captivity is the Yeshuv's self-image in this war, of this war, half excuse and half truth. Its power or potential for action is seen as held captive. More so, it indicates that the military and war are themselves form of captivity, and anyone who has become a soldier knows just how like a prison a military base and the military itself can be. Ben Aaron is also excusing himself here for having fallen captive, for not having fought to the last bullet and having fallen captive in such a bureaucratic manner. The apologetic tone is evidence of the conflict that accompanies service in the British Army, even if geared towards war with Nazi Germany. The Hebrew soldier is in a conflicted position, serving the colonizer, and therefore already suspect, even if in his own eyes, of collaboration. The norms of the militia, the Palmach, are different, based on locality and enmity that precludes the possibility of captivity, in view of an enemy that is irregular and cannot be trusted. The militia does fight to the last bullet, as the stories promoted, as the stories of 48. The convoys, for example, demonstrate. It is in this context that the episode of the paratroopers in World War II deserves some more attention. It is the only part of Jewish participation in the war that is remembered in Israeli culture, the Yishuv of the Hebrew participation. And in the context of captivity, it presents a radical shift from the norms of the brigade to the militia. The paratroopers were trained by the British for special operations and came mostly from the kibbutzim and the Palmach. The first couple were parachuted in late 1943, and of the 33, 12 were captured and 7 were executed. The discursive, is discursive still good? Not as good as discourse, but
you're in literature, so you're allowed.
That's even worse. You borrow it from historians. The discursive effort invested in promoting this meager and ineffective episode as the image of the war, or of the Hebrew effort in the war, the Yeshuv's effort in the war, is well noted and evident in the figure of Hannah Senesh, whose diary and poems became the biggest bestseller in Hebrew letters during the 50s. This is a fact. The fact that needs to be stressed in this context is that the failure of the paratroopers, their capture, imprisonment, and in some case execution, can and perhaps must be thought of in terms of captivity, and of their being prisoners of war. For example, Yova Gilgovsky and Aria Arni, the first to jump, Fichman Arni, the first to jump in Romania, were dropped in the outskirts of Bucharest, caught immediately, and spent the rest of the war in captivity. Their accounts of captivity were published shortly after their return. Both Arni and Gogovsky were killed in 1954 in the Maagan disaster, in Ason Maagan. It's really interesting. When a plane carrying a message from Haim Weizmann that was supposed to be dropped, just like a paratrooper, crashed into the crowd, killing Enzo Sereni's only son, etc., etc. A horrible story. Hannah Senesh, executed in Hungary in November 44, was a poet of some talent and became an instant hero, a local Jeanne d'Arc. Beautiful, virginal, and brave, she defied the Hungarian court, refusing to recognize its authority and asked for amnesty, claiming that her real home was in Eretz Yisrael. It is precisely this choice that captivated culture and signaled the change that it craved. Not only did she belong to the Palmach and the Kibbutz, she was the antithesis of Ben Aaron and the older generation of soldiers in the regular army. She defied gravity, jumped over the line, and was willing to do what others were not, to pay the ultimate price. From the point of view of the new generation of the militia in Palestine, falling captive and asking for amnesty was the same. In the end, they are forms of treason, at least towards their ideal. It remains striking that in the short time that passed between the World War and 1948 war, norms of captivity changed so drastically. The passage is clearly visible in literature, as the experience of participation in the war is elaborated now from a local point of view. In a story, there are many stories, I'll just bring a little piece from one. In a story called Autumn Night, that was published in the second volume of Le'Lekut HaRe'im, which is considered the beginning of the 48 generation, culture, etc., etc., in the summer of 1945, that is written at the end of the war by Yigal Mosin, in the story written by Yigal Mosin, a prominent figure in the nascent culture of the militia. It represents service in the British Army through the proximity between captivity and prostitution. Now, there's a lot to be said about prostitution and the anxiety about the Hebrew soldiers going into the British Army and encountering prostitutes, etc., etc. It's a whole issue, but this is its summary. One autumn night, the narrator gets into a cab in Tel Aviv, and the driver begins to tell him his story. The tale begins with the driver being stranded by the British in Crete, and he is miraculously saved by Australians. The situation clearly relates to Ben Aaron's tale. The words are the same. I mean, it's obviously there is a connection. Though instead of becoming captive, the driver receives a short leave and manages to escape and gets a leave in Palestine. As he arrives home after 2 years at the front, he finds that his children have been placed in an institution and that his wife, his neighbors tell him, is in the cafe making a lot of money. He goes there and finds that in his absence, she has become more or less a prostitute for the British soldiers. Drunk and traumatized, he kills her. This is his story. Apparently nothing is said about it. He's not punished for anything. He was not in jail or anything like that. He just tells them how he killed her. The story ends with the narrator walking in the streets contemplating autumn. That's classic Hebrew literature for you. What? Yeah. While the reader is left to realize that serving the colonial master, while the reader is left to realize that serving the colonial master is always a form of prostitution. The driver would have been better off captive, his heroism pointless, if in the meantime his home is prey to the very same master he is serving. Hebrew power, the story seems to say, is in captivity as long as it serves the British, and as long as it has and Hebrew power has only one home, and it is the one it must defend. Thank you very much.
Our last speaker of this session is Dr. Raquel Stepak. Different approaches towards the involvement of authors in the Eretz Israel in the war effort. Please.
I will speak about the different approaches towards the involvement of authors in the land of Israel in the war efforts. If I ask you to picture in your minds what an author looks like, it usually is a man sitting at his desk holding a pen in one hand and writing under great inspiration. And it's far from the image of a fighter, of a soldier in the battlefront with a rifle fighting. And that is one of the things that the authors in the land of Israel had to cope with when World War II broke out. So, during World War II, the authors deliberated over the political, social, and literary responsibility of the author during the war, and they reached different conclusions. One of the synonyms for authors is men of letters. Well, in times of war, what happens to the men and what happens to the letters? Let's start with the letters. Should the authors recruit their pens to write literature of propaganda? Do they need to encourage the people to enlist in the army? Or do they just keep on writing their literature as before? And the men themselves, should they enlist in the army? And if they do so, do they need to serve just like any other soldier? Or as authors, do they have a responsibility to create literary texts, military literature, war literature? These are the main questions that arose in the discourse of the authors over the press and also in the special conferences of the Writers Association. Spoiler to all of these questions, if all of the answers are correct. The war and the Holocaust presented unique challenges for the community of Hebrew writers in the land of Israel, both on a moral and poetic level. The days of World War II were a time of anxiety in the Yishuv, especially between the years 1940 and 1942, when the Yishuv was several times under a threat of invasion or attack by the Axis armies. And as of course researched before, many of the Jewish people in Palestine recruited to the British Army, about approximately 30,000 and more. And among them were a few dozen writers, Hebrew writers. I will just name a few of the more familiar names, like Amir Gilboa, Dov Chomsky, Binyamin Galai, Noach Stern, and Elo Vilensky Amitan, a woman author, and the editor Moshe Mosinson, which Uri mentioned. Most of them had a deep connection to the diaspora. They had made Aliyah in the 1920s and the 1930s from Eastern and Central Europe. Many of them left their families and their friends behind. And when the news of the Holocaust reached the Yishuv, and it reached from the beginning, it didn't give a whole picture, and the news came in delay about the Holocaust, but in November of 1942, the Jewish Agency issued a statement that annihilation of Jews is happening in Poland, as you can see in the Palestine Post on November 23rd. The title on the left, Slaughter of Europe Jews, Annihilation of Entire Communities. This created kind of an earthquake for the Yishuv. It was a very dramatic announcement. And it was a milestone in the response of the Yishuv to the Holocaust. And the motivations for enlistment, as I mentioned, there was the fear of attack of the Yishuv. There was news of the Holocaust going on, and there were many motivations for enlistment in the British Army. And it is also possible there are personal reasons for a person to enlist, such as making a living or personal fulfillment. But I think that the authors, as men of letters, with the social responsibility, felt more obligated to serve in the army and to set example for other people. They were public figures. So, first voices for the enlistment of writers into the army were heard since the beginning of the war, when a very prominent poet, Avraham Shlonsky, wrote in October of 1939 that the poets should enlist just like any other citizen. There is no possibility to enlist the pure, real poetry to the civil service in time of emergency. Therefore, the poetry, no. And the poet, as a person, as a citizen, yes. Together with everyone and exactly like everyone. Meaning, in the very tools of defense and not in the tools of creation. The Writers' Association was the professional body that represented the authors in the land of Israel, Agudat HaSofrim in Hebrew, was in connection with the recruitment center of the Jewish Agency. And the Jewish Agency encouraged the writers to create, I quote, an atmosphere in favor of enlistment. In October 1940, the Jewish Agency appealed to the Writers' Association with regard to recruitment of the writers. The association's committee decided to respond that all of the members of the association were above the age of recruitment that was announced at that time. In the association's archives, I found a letter, and I don't know if there are more examples, but I found just one letter there, regarding a young poet named Asher Zelig Posek, who was eligible for enlistment but did not enlist. So, the recruitment center declared that he was evading his national obligation and asked the Writers' Association, if he is a member, in fact, to remove him from the association. And the matter was resolved when later Posek did eventually enlist. We can see him here with his friend, the poet Amir Gilboa, in 1946, both of them in uniforms in Antwerp. The activity in the matter of recruitment of writer had reached its peak in July of 1942. It was also a time of the greatest anxiety in the issue from the possible invasion from the south. And the first day of the conference was adjourned by a poet named Pesach Lipovitsky. He was already a soldier in the British Army, and he was a poet. He spoke to the assembly, urging them to become partners in the war, quote, not only as victims, but as activists. According to research by Rafi Agnon, on the first day of the conference, a group of writers organized. Their identities are not known. They presented a petition which tens of writers signed, calling for a decision of the conference that all of the writers should enlist. This petition apparently caught the organizers of the conference by surprise, and a notice was published the following day in the paper Devar. This is a translation. They said in the petition, the only deed that will give way to our words is, in our opinion, an en masse arrival of all participants of this conference for recruitment at the nearby recruiting office, which will later determine the service suitable for each, old and young. Whoever does not keep the order of the hour with his own body has no right to speak to the public. This petition led to a very lively debate on the second day of the conference on the subject of how should a man of letters express his involvement in favor of the war effort. Rabbi Binyamin was one of the main activists in the field of bringing the subject of enlistment of the Yishuv in general and of the authors in particular, and in his speech he claimed that besides the author's duty to enlist, they also hold the power to influence the public to enlist. He said, for the first time, the Hebrew word has the power to influence the course of that battle and that war. Moshe Shartok, later Sharet, manager of the political department of the Jewish Agency, called on young authors. This is from the Palestine Post. From the fifth line, he called on young authors to enlist in order to build up the literature of the future in which the portraying of army life and war experiences would inevitably play a prominent part. If, quote, if the authors of today do not become the soldiers of tomorrow, then the soldiers of today will be the authors of the future. This is a very interesting notion, and I'll come back to this very shortly. Many writers spoke at the conference for the enlistment of authors in the British Army. Another voice was heard in this conference. It was Mordechai Ovadiahu, an author, that said, on the other hand, made the claim that the expectation of writers is not for physical enlistment, but rather for a literary enlistment. He suggested that the Jewish Agency and the Writers Association send the authors in Eretz Yisrael to army camps, and the authors would meet the soldiers, hear from them about their experiences, and then put them to writing in their literature. So about a month after the conference, there was an assembly held in Bet Bialik in Tel Aviv in order to evaluate the results of this conference. One of the speakers, Aaron Hermoni, spoke about the conference's effect on the enlistment of writers, and he claimed that maybe 2 or 3 writers really enlisted after this conference, and he doesn't think that the lectures and speeches that were heard there were the motivation that led them to really to enlist. But in the end of the meeting in Bet Bialik in August, They made a declaration by the representatives of the Writers Association saying, every Hebrew writer, whether he is of age of recruitment or above that age, but is able to enlist immediately, should fulfill his duty. So, as I just said, it is interesting to note that what Moshe Sharet said about the literature of the future was quite accurate. The authors that enlisted in the British Army created literature both in real time and after the war with great impact from their experiences in the army. So, and also, it was a part of their identity as a new rising literary generation in Hebrew literature, the 1948 generation that also already mentioned, that the Shach generation. So the general thesis that I work with is that there is a strong connection between the life and literature, and that historic circumstances affect the writer's work. So to demonstrate this, I will just bring two short examples of poets, both of whom belong to this 1948 generation, Binyamin Galai and Amir Gilboa. So the experiences, these are just examples, and there are many others. And their experiences led to a creation of a body of work with similar attributes, such as the setting of their literature, the motifs, and the themes. And with regard to themes, the subject of death, naturally, is dominant in many of these works. Binyamin Galai was born in 1921 in Vladivostok in the Soviet Union. In 1926, his family made Aliyah to Eretz Israel. He served in the Royal Air Force between 1940 and 1946. Looking through Galai's archives, you find his the Airman Service and Paybook. Probably a document he had to carry around at all times, and probably something he would look through when he was bored. And as some of us know, in Army service, there are times of boredom. So in the last 2 pages of the 8 pages of this book, there are specimens of wills, and then the last page is a blank form for the soldier to fill of his own will. So if you are a poet and you are in the army and you ponder a lot about your death, upcoming, maybe dying, it might be inspiration for poetry. So I think, not by coincidence, he wrote a poem called Tzava'a L'Re'i in 1943. And this is in Hebrew. I'll give you the content in English. It specifies what the friend should do in case the writer dies. The feeling that the writer feels like death might strike at any second, and he asks his friend to deliver his bag to the smiley girl that sells the melons in the market. His book of poems by Rimbaud he offers as payment that the friend might use to pay a prostitute, and Lotti's books he can use to buy wine. For the ascent of his soul, Ilui Nishmato, he asks him to sing the song of Mary Jean, which he will always love even after he dies. And this is about the subject of death, just an example. And the Holocaust is another important theme in this body of literature of the writers in uniforms. Amir Gilboa was born in Radzivilov in Ukraine in 1914, made Aliyah in 1938. And the sad story in this case is that he left his family, his parents, and 6 brothers and sisters behind. And he didn't even say goodbye because he had to escape with the Chalutz. So he made Aliyah in 1938 and then enlisted in the army in July of 42 and became a driver. And Amir Gilboa had a very strong feeling, almost like a premonition, that his family members had died in the Holocaust. And on the 3rd of December 1942, he wrote a very sad letter to the poet Natan Alterman, in which he expressed his fear that the worst had happened to his parents and siblings. He later found out that his parents and 6 brothers and sisters, all in this picture, all died in the Holocaust. He wrote a few poems about the fate of his family. And in a poem he wrote on the evening of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, 1944, his brother called for him. They whisper, Yoshua and Moshe, both my brothers, Beryl, the land is on fire. In conclusion, we heard different voices of authors and different actions taken by them and by the Writers Association. They held a very lively discussion regarding their involvement and also took action. Thank you.
I think we had 3 inspiring lectures. Uri. And I open the floor to questions, to discussion. I think we had a very provocating lesson, please. Lunch is not ready yet.
Okay. Could we ask Leonid, where did he get the letters from exactly? I'm not sure he said it.
Now?
Okay.
Where is them now?
No, where did you get them?
Yes. Yes. I copied a part of collection was copied from the archives of Belarus and some other places where I visit for a scholar trip. But the vast majority of the letters I received from family archives. And I have a number of cases when I listen that in the family there is nobody to preserve, so please take and to use it for scholarly aims. And to another points, in other cases, I listen that we have children, we have grandchildren, but they don't interested, they don't know how it is worth. So I prefer to that original of letters, it will be in Hebrew makor, preserved in university. On the name of university, all these family received an official letter that we preserved it and used for scholar aims. So we have very interesting material, classified, and have keywords to each letter. And it is also in paper and also in digital. So each researcher could see and to work with these materials. Yes.
How did you get the diaries? I'm not speaking about the letters. The diaries you spoke about, because diaries in the Soviet for Jews, written by Jews in the Soviet Union, is quite. It's not very common.
Every time I ask not only letters but also diaries and other points of documents. And sometimes I listen that we don't preserve letters, but we have diaries. But diaries show it is not a piece of your interest, so I don't like to show it. No, the diaries, it is the most interesting things. And some of them I received to copy, and some of them I received in original to preserve.
Of Jewish soldiers?
Jewish soldiers, Jewish soldiers, as well as Jewish children from evacuation in the age of 13, 14, 15, but also we have a diary of the former of the former Pravda newspaper Correspondence. It is somewhat about 100 pages, and I make to compare with his papers in Pravda and his papers in Diary. It's a great, great difference.
Many things. Many things.
Raquel, World War II inspired the authors to write in real time some books, some let's say poems, but not from the front itself. I say in Israel or in the land of Israel, because I don't know about many.
Yes, so that was the subject of my dissertation, and well, the common belief in the public is that people in the land of Israel, and especially authors, ignored the Holocaust and kept on living their lives as usual, but they didn't. The authors wrote many poems, stories, and especially and articles, hundreds.
To the briefcases, or it was published?
Published in the daily, in the literary supplements and in periodicals, literary periodicals. There are just hundreds of works.
Did they use the power of the force of writing to propaganda matters?
Yes, they did. Well, they wrote articles encouraging people to donate for the Magbit, to enlist in the army, and maybe the most influential movement was Aldomi, which Dino Porat explored, Rabbi Binyamin, which I mentioned, and Fisher Schneerson were the leaders of this movement, and they tried to bring the subject of the Holocaust into the Seder Yom agenda. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going 3 o'clock?
No?
The next sessions? 3 o'clock. Okay. Thank you very much.